Have you ever looked around your life, at the clothes hanging in your closet, the latest phone in your hand, the number of notifications lighting up your screen, and still felt empty? We live in a time where we have more than any generation before us, more choices, more comfort, more convenience, but somehow we're more anxious, more depressed, and more disconnected than ever. It's strange, isn't it? We can summon food to our doors in minutes, we can talk to people across the planet in seconds, we can scroll through endless entertainment for hours, and yet, in the quiet moments, we ache, not from hunger, but from hollowness. So here's the question that no one dares to ask. Why do we have everything, but still feel like nothing? We chase more success, more money, more stuff, thinking it'll fill that void, but the void only grows. No matter how high we climb, there's always another peak. No matter how much we buy, there's always something newer. No matter how many people like our posts, we still feel unseen. What if the answer isn't in getting more, but in needing less? What if fulfillment doesn't come from what you add, but what you let go of? What if the ancient teachings of Buddhism, yes, those quiet, profound whispers from 2,500 years ago, hold the key to this modern chaos? What if the secret to true happiness isn't buried in your next achievement, but in learning how to be at peace with what you already have? In this journey, we'll explore why Buddhism teaches us to live with less, not as a sacrifice, but as a path to freedom, to presence, to wholeness. Let's begin where all suffering begins, not in the world around us, but in the craving within us. They say the modern world is drowning in noise, but 2,500 years ago, a man sat under a tree, and discovered the silence behind it all. That man was Siddhartha Gautama. We know him as the Buddha, not a god, not a prophet, but a human being, who looked into the heart of existence and asked, why do we suffer? He had it all, wealth, luxury, a royal life shielded from pain, until one day, he stepped outside the palace gates. What he saw changed him forever: an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a monk, serene in the face of it all. It was then he realized, even the most lavish life couldn't escape the truth of suffering, and so, he left everything, to understand it. After years of searching, meditation, and asceticism, under the Bodhi tree, it became clear: suffering exists, it has a cause, it can end, and there is a path to its end. This became the Four Noble Truths, the foundation of Buddhism. But at the center of it all, was one radical insight: the root of suffering is desire. Tanha, craving, thirst, the endless hunger for more. Not just craving for things, but for control, for approval, for permanence in a world that is always changing. It's the voice in your head that says, I'll be happy when I get that job. When they finally love me back. When I lose 10 pounds. When I make 6 figures. But when one comes, it only gives birth to another when. This cycle is samsara, the wheel of becoming. We run and run, chasing clouds, mistaking them for mountains. Today, that desire looks like dopamine hits. It's the urge to scroll one more time, the need to buy what we don't need, the fear of missing out. It's endless comparison, always believing someone else is ahead, and yet. The Buddha's message was shockingly simple: desire is the fire, let it go, and you are free. Not free in the sense of having no responsibilities, but free from being enslaved by the illusion that happiness lies somewhere else. But how do we let go, in a world that constantly tells us to hold on? The answer is not about retreating to a cave, or giving away all your possessions. It's about discovering the joy of enough, not the poverty of denial, but the richness of contentment. We've been taught that more is always better: more money, more status, more experiences, more followers. But what if the most powerful word you could ever say is enough? In the ancient Pali language, there is a beautiful word, santuthi. It means contentment, not resignation, but a deep, grounded sense of peace with what is, not because you've given up, but because you've finally arrived. There's a story from the time of the Buddha. A wealthy merchant visited a monastery. He saw the monks living with only 3 robes and a bowl. He asked one elder monk, "Aren't you missing out on life?" The monk smiled and replied, "I could ask you the same, with so much to take care of. How do you have time to live? That struck the merchant. He had built an empire, but he hadn't slept well in years. You see, we confuse abundance with enough. We think the one with the most wins, but in truth, the one who needs the least is the richest of all, as the Buddha said, Santuthi paramam dhanam. Contentment is the greatest wealth. It's not the wealth that buys freedom, it's the freedom from needing wealth that brings true peace. Think about it, how much of our stress, our chasing, our comparison, comes from the feeling that what we have is never quite enough, but when you begin to see life through the lens of Santuthi, everything changes. You stop measuring life by accumulation and start appreciating it in presence. Have you ever decluttered your home and suddenly felt your mind breathe? Have you ever paused after a simple meal and felt surprisingly full, not just in your stomach, but in your soul? That Santuthi, the deep, unshakable joy of not needing more to feel complete. It's not about becoming a minimalist for aesthetics, it's about discovering that what's essential was never outside you. Practical angle, start with small shifts. The next time you feel the urge to upgrade, pause, ask, do I really need this, or do I just need to feel better? Gratitude and contentment go hand in hand. The more you notice what you already have, the less you feel pulled to fill a hole that doesn't actually exist. But here's the beautiful paradox. When you stop craving more, life begins to give you more clarity, more peace, more space to breathe, and that space is where true simplicity begins. Santuthi, contentment, is the feeling of having enough, but how do we live that truth in a world that constantly screams, "You're not enough until you have more"? The answer is not just to own less, but to live more mindfully with what we already have. This is the heart of mindful minimalism, not just cleaning your closet, but cleansing your mind, not just decluttering your space, but untangling the mental clutter that keeps you anxious, distracted, and overwhelmed. Think about it. When your desk is buried under papers, you struggle to focus. When your phone is buzzing every minute, you struggle to think clearly. When your calendar is packed with noise, there's no room for stillness. And without stillness, there is no clarity, no peace, no presence. The Buddha once said, as a lake becomes clear when the mud settles, so too the mind becomes clear when we stop stirring it. But we stir our minds constantly, with things, with tasks, with noise. Minimalism today is often seen as a design trend, white walls, wooden furniture, and Instagram-perfect rooms. But in Buddhism, simplicity is a spiritual discipline. It's not about having less to impress others, it's about having less so your mind has space to breathe. A Zen proverb says, the usefulness of a cup is in its emptiness. Too full of stuff, thoughts, ego, and you leave no room for wisdom to enter. In the Buddhist tradition, monks carry only one bowl. Every day, they walk silently through villages, receiving whatever people offer, rice, curry, soup. They eat what's given, they want for nothing. That bowl isn't just for food, it's a symbol. It reminds them, you don't need to carry more to be whole. What if we treated our lives like that bowl? What if we asked ourselves, what am I carrying that I no longer need? Is it physical clutter, an overflowing wardrobe filled with clothes we never wear? Is it emotional clutter, old resentments, expectations, comparisons? Is it digital clutter, notifications, emails, endless apps, that keep your mind fragmented? Mindful minimalism asks not, what do I need to get rid of? But rather, what is truly worth keeping? It invites you to choose quality over quantity, silence over noise, depth over distraction. When your environment becomes simple, your decisions become easier, your thoughts become lighter, your presence becomes stronger. No more chasing every option, no more living in reaction. You begin to reclaim your focus, your energy, your life. But minimalism isn't just about outer simplicity, it also transforms your inner world. As we simplify what we own, we begin to see something deeper, that true freedom isn't outside, it's in the way we relate to everything. Once we begin to simplify, we notice something unexpected. In the empty spaces, joy appears, peace arises, and something ancient begins to stir inside us, a deeper form of wealth, not the kind stored in banks, but the kind that fills the soul. This is inner wealth, and it begins with 3 powerful practices: giving, stillness, And non-attachment, let's begin with the first. 1. The joy of giving. You have more than you think. In Buddhism, generosity is the first perfection, dana, not by accident. It's the doorway to liberation. Why? Because when you give, you declare, I am not lacking, I am full, I have enough to share. That's not poverty, that's abundance in its purest form. You don't need to be rich to give. You can give a kind word, a silent prayer, a seat on the bus, or your full attention. The Buddha said, if you knew what I know about the power of giving, you would not let a single day pass without sharing something. And here's the magic: when you give, without wanting anything back, your heart opens, your grip loosens, and suffering begins to dissolve. True generosity isn't about loss, it's about freedom. 2. Stillness, the forgotten source of energy. We often think productivity equals movement, but the deepest power comes from stillness. A calm lake reflects the sky, a still mind reflects wisdom. The Buddha himself spent hours in silence. Not because he was hiding from life, but because he was fully immersed in it. Stillness is not the absence of action, it's the presence of awareness. When you sit quietly and breathe, you begin to see, all that noise in your mind, it's just passing clouds, and beneath it, a vast, silent sky. That's your true nature, and from that stillness, comes clarity, compassion, and unshakable peace. 3. Non-attachment, letting go without losing. Now we come to perhaps the most misunderstood idea in Buddhism, non-attachment. People often think it means not caring, but that's not it at all. Non-attachment means, I love you, I honor this moment, but I do not cling. It means I walk through life with open hands, not clenched fists. It means I enjoy beauty without trying to possess it. I feel pain without being defined by it. I have desires, but they don't have me, the Buddha taught. You only lose what you cling to. And in that single sentence lies profound freedom. When we hold lightly, we suffer less, we love more, and we live with grace. Non-attachment doesn't take you away from life. It brings you deeper into it, because now, you're not afraid to lose anything, and so you're finally free to appreciate everything. Inner wealth isn't measured in possessions, it's measured in peace, in generosity, in the ability to let go, and still smile. But this inner wealth becomes even more powerful when it flows into our daily actions. What does Buddhist wisdom look like, not just in temples, but in the real world? What happens when we apply these teachings to how we work, eat, walk, talk, even scroll our phones? Now that we've explored the wealth inside, the joy of giving, the clarity of stillness, the freedom of non-attachment, the question naturally arises, how do we begin? How do we bring this ancient wisdom into our modern, busy, noisy lives? How do we take what the Buddha lived, what monks practice, what great teachers teach, and apply it to our morning routines, our emails, our kitchens, our relationships? Here's the good news. You don't need to change everything overnight. You don't need to become a monk or move to a mountain. You just need to start, gently, mindfully, and with heart. Let's begin with simple, powerful steps that will help you live with less and feel much, much more. 1. Wake up with intention, not distraction. Most of us begin our day by reaching for our phones. Before we even take our first breath consciously, we're checking messages, news, notifications. But what if, tomorrow morning, you took just 60 seconds to breathe deeply, to feel your body, and whisper a simple question: what truly matters today? That one breath can anchor your whole day in clarity instead of chaos. This is the Buddhist art of right intention, beginning your day not with reactivity, but with mindful purpose. 2. One in, one out. Every time you bring something new into your life, ask yourself, is there something I'm ready to release? One shirt in. Let one go, one app installed. Delete another, one commitment added. Say no to something unnecessary. This small rule, one in, one out, keeps your life flowing like a river, not hoarding, not stagnant, but always moving, always clear. Minimalism isn't about owning nothing, it's about owning what serves your peace. 3. Digital declutter, spiritual clarity. We carry temples in our pockets, but often worship the wrong gods, likes, scrolls, algorithms. Take 1 hour each week, turn off your phone, hide your laptop, and just be, breathe, walk, read a sutra, sip tea without distraction. This isn't doing nothing. This is doing something holy, reclaiming your presence. The Buddha taught mindfulness in forests. You can practice it in airplane mode. 4. Create a sacred corner. You don't need a temple, you just need one corner, a small cushion, a candle, maybe a quote that speaks to your soul. Return to it daily. Sit, breathe, come home to yourself. Over time, this tiny corner becomes your sanctuary, a reminder that peace is not a destination, it's a daily return. 5. Buy with breath. Before any purchase, pause, just one breath. Ask yourself, is this filling a real need, or feeding a fleeting craving? Most of our consumption is emotional, not essential. That one breath is the gap between reaction and wisdom, between mindless spending and mindful living. That breath is your freedom. 6. Practice grateful reflection before sleep, before bed. Don't scroll, reflect. What did I experience today that was enough? What simple moment brought peace, joy, or meaning? Write down just one thing. That's how you begin to train your mind to notice fullness, not emptiness. Gratitude transforms what you have into more than enough. 7. Embrace less as a daily mantra. Less distraction, less clutter, less noise, less rushing, and in return, more clarity, more space, more presence, more life. Each day, ask not what can I add, but what can I release? This is how you live with less, and feel more. These steps are simple, but not small, because every breath taken with awareness, every item released with grace, every moment lived with intention, changes your life. And when enough of those moments come together, you begin to realize, you don't need more to live fully, you only need to awaken to what's already here. In the final chapter, we'll return to where we began, to the question that lives in the silence of our hearts. Can less truly lead to more, and what does it mean to live fully, without holding anything at all? We've walked a long way together, from the cluttered noise of the world, to the simple, profound practice of living with less, and now, we arrive at a simple but profound truth. True freedom isn't about having less stuff, it's about having less attachment to everything you thought you needed. It's about the ability to love fully without holding on too tightly, to love what is, right here, right now, without needing to change it. 1. The paradox of less and more. As we simplify our lives, it may feel like we're giving up things. We may let go of desires, material possessions, the need to be constantly busy, but in that space, in the absence of distraction and accumulation, we find true abundance. We discover that we already have everything we need, right here in this moment, and in that discovery, we realize we are not lacking at all. True freedom comes when we stop searching for more, when we stop chasing what's out of reach, and start embracing what is right in front of us. This is living with less, but feeling more, loving more, being more. 2. Loving what is, the heart of freedom. Indiana Buddhism, there is a powerful teaching called right acceptance. It's the ability to accept life as it comes, without resistance, without clinging, without wishing it were different. What does that look like in your life? It's learning to love your body. Even if it's not perfect, it's appreciating the people around you, even if they are not who you expected. It's finding peace in the work you do, even if it's not your dream job. Loving what is doesn't mean giving up aspirations. It means realizing that true happiness doesn't come from having things your way. It comes from being content with the way things already are. This is where the real joy lies, in the present moment. In the life you are already living, in the imperfect, beautiful mess of it all. 3. The freedom to live fully. When you live with less attachment, you find the freedom to live fully, to love deeply, to give generously, to laugh, cry, and breathe without fear. This is the freedom the Buddha taught, the freedom to let go of what you cannot control, and embrace what you can, the present moment, the people around you, the life unfolding before you. True freedom is letting go of the weight of everything you thought you needed, and realizing you've been free all along. 4. Embrace simplicity, embrace life. So, here's the invitation: start today, start small, but start. If you're feeling overwhelmed by clutter, choose one thing to let go of. If you're feeling overwhelmed by expectations, choose one thing to embrace, just as it is. If you're feeling lost in the noise, take a moment of stillness, and remember that you don't need more to be whole. The more you simplify, the more you will see that everything you need is already here. And when you live this way, with less attachment and more love, you will find yourself free. If this journey of living with less has resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. What is one thing you're ready to let go of, or one small step you're taking toward living more simply? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this conversation. And if you found value in this video, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more Buddhist wisdom, and click the bell to stay connected. Remember, Zen is not just in the temples, it's in how we live, how we breathe, and how we love. Thank you for sharing this space with me. Until next time, may you find peace in less, and joy in what is.